learned the technologies and techniques, and frankly, kudos to them for developing these techniques. But they've learned to go down and turn that drill bit and make a right angle and actually follow that formation in a horizontal direction along the formation. And in this case, in place of the Utica and Marcellus shales here in Ohio, they're some 6,000 feet down, and then they can make their right angle turn and go another 5, maybe 10,000 feet linearly along that particular type of shale gas formation. And certainly it opens up the opportunity for a whole range of other activities and the more robust exploitation of that resource. So, how is this different? It's different in almost every way. Obviously, it's a bigger well, it's a deeper well, larger diameter at the top, excuse me, roughly the same diameter at the bottom. You know that they do everything much like they did before, with the exception of a much larger scale. And of course, they also will case this well. They'll also cement this well just like a regular well. And then they use a process called high-volume hydrofracturing. And why is it called high-volume hydrofracturing, and how does it differ from what they were always doing before? You've seen these TV commercials that say, we've been fracking in Ohio for 80 years. It's absolutely true. They've been fracking on many farms around Ashtabula and Trumbull County for 80 years. And many of us have oil and gas wells on our property. So we know the technique of hydrofracturing itself is not new. What is new is the volume and the processes involved in this. Where traditionally the hydrofracking process would have used 300,000, maybe 400,000 gallons of water. That's a lot of water when you see them start trucking those tanker trucks into your farm preparing for a frac job. Looks like a lot. In this case, the volumes are many, many times that. In fact, anywhere from 2 million to 7.8 million gallons per hydrofracturing job. And they use a whole different constellation of products. Of course, many of these are proprietary formulas. Many of the products that the individual drillers use are so-called trade secrets. In fact, the Energy and Commerce Committee had a hearing last year where they extracted a bunch of additional information from oil and gas drillers in the United States. And they extracted a number of, I think, 750 different compounds they use. Let me see what I've got here. 750 different chemical compounds used to put together into 25 individual products. And 279 of those were regarded as trade secrets, and they wouldn't even reveal them to Congress. So you know that there's something pretty unique about this. And what they're trying to do, take massive amounts of water, pump it down a well that they have perforated, and by perforation, of course, you know, you've got the well that's drilled, you've got it cased with steel, then they pump concrete in to seal it, and on the TV commercials they tell us we've got a self-confined unit here. And it is indeed a self-confined unit until they do the perforation. And the perforation is, I think, literally an explosive process that occurs within the well casing. And it's designed to perforate the well casing and to begin a little bit of a notch or a perforation in the shale gas, the shale areas. And once those perforations have begun, then this hydrofracturing process can do its work. What they'll do is compound pumps on top of pumps on top of pumps and pipe roughly 5 million gallons of water, a whole bunch of sand, and the sand is designed to hold the fissures of the oil shale open once the fracturing is complete, and a whole bunch of interesting and uniquely configured and engineered chemicals that are designed to keep that sand in suspension as it goes the maybe 10,000 feet down, or 6,000 feet down and 10,000 feet out to the perforation areas, and hold that sand in suspension until it can get to the target areas within the formation. And then, of course, allow the gas and oil to come back out through. So that's the trick and the technology they're trying to achieve, and apparently the development and the refinement of these particular processes, the engineering of the fluid and the turning of the bit, is what opened up this shale to development here in Ohio. We always knew the Marcellus was down there. We always knew the Utica was down there. But until they learned to turn the drill bit, and until they learned to engineer these fluids to do what they wanted, that shale was sort of too costly and too expensive to retrieve. Now it's something that's going to be achievable. Oh, once again, wrong button. Sorry about that. Okay. Once again, how's it different? Much more fresh water used than before. Much more chemicals, much more toxic air emissions, because what must go down comes back up, and much of it comes back up in ways that are difficult to control, if not impossible to control. Much more truck traffic, much more toxic waste required, more intense industrial scale development. Implications for farming and rural communities. Competition for water resources. You know, we've had a terrible wet year this year. And normally this region of the country and this area of the state, we usually don't suffer for water. But in this year's legislative endeavors, when we were talking about the Great Lakes Compact, the industry wanted 5 million gallons of water removal available without a permit. And frankly, the Ohio Environmental Council and a lot of other organizations thought that that was way too much, because removing 5 million gallons from most streams will impact them severely. And so we had grave concerns about that. So 5 million gallons, it got passed anyway, but our neighbors in Michigan and New York threatened to sue us, so it got vetoed. So we're back to the drawing board there. Interestingly, that 5 million gallons is what we're talking about here today. And so we're talking about the potential to severely modify the aquatic circumstances in a stream in most parts of the area, even in a wet area like northeastern Ohio. So competition for water resources is really a significant thing. And frankly, we saw it play out recently in Texas. They've, of course, been under a horrible drought anyway, and they had the wildfires going on. They also are in the middle of a hydrofracking boom down in Texas, as you wouldn't be surprised. And so as a result, they have these wildfires going, and you have fire departments going from place to place, trying to find a place they can extract a little bit of water from. Since the hydrofracking areas have been going pretty strong, that made their challenge even more and more difficult. Impact on toxic air emissions, and we'll talk about that a little bit later in its relationship to both human health and animal health. And landscape disruption and fragmentation. We'll talk about that a little bit later too. And of course, community and economic effects. Talk a little more about the competition for water resources. I mentioned this briefly. Texas, once again, we're talking about 5 million gallons per hydrofracking job. Keep in mind that an individual well, once drilled, once again, instead of having 300 feet of exposure to the given target shale, you now have 10,000 feet perhaps, potentially, of target area, so they can come in and refracture those wells up to 18 times. Just move a little further down the pipe, perforate and refracture, a little further down the pipe, reperforate, refracture. So these wells can be fracked up to 18 times, and you do the math on that, we're talking about 70 to 300 times the amount of water that was used in conventional hydrofracking. And many of you have seen a video or a movie called Gasland. It's a movie that actually featured some of the, you'd have to say, horrific experiences that some of our neighbors in Pennsylvania and New York, and even some of our neighbors out in the western part of the United States, Wyoming, Colorado, have experienced in communities where hydrofracturing has transpired already. This depicts a flame actually coming out of a water tap in a home in New York, I believe. And actually what had transpired is what is a somewhat common occurrence with regard to hydrofracturing, and that is methane infiltration. Methane is one of the naturally occurring gases that occurs in the environment in various strata. And so either in the target strata down in the shale gas or in one of the upper stratas, methane had been in place. When the hydrofracturing and all that mayhem occurred, methane has gotten loose and come up into the well water regime of an individual house And so in several houses there have been places where this sort of thing can happen. Obviously not a good thing to happen in your house or my house or anybody else's house. And it is indeed a rarity. So it is not something that is going to happen in your house if you sign a lease. However, Duke University, a well-respected university, had just completed a study 2010, and what they found was that there is a 17% increase in well water within 0.6 of a mile of almost every water location that they found in New York. And frankly, this is not a good indicator. What it indicates is that something is happening that the industry did not expect, that the industry did not intend, and of course the industry says, well, it's not our fault. Methane that was naturally in the soil just started coming loose and it came up into the water table. It's not our fault, so don't worry about it. But frankly, it is a question that begs an answer, and we'll talk a little bit more later about developing answers to that. Once again, methane can contribute to pollution of groundwater, lakes, rivers, etc., etc. Impacts on crop production. Here's a little slide about where the spills normally go. This is a slide from Colorado. 924 spills documented between 2002 and 2006. Of those, looks like 182 were spills that affected groundwater, affected water or groundwater or surface water. Of those, 130 were groundwater and 52 were surface water. So about twice as likely to be an impact on groundwater as it is to surface water. And why are we worried about infiltration through this system? Well, one of the reasons that we're concerned about that is the vast array of chemicals. We referred to those earlier. Many of them are referred to by trade names and product names that were unfamiliar. But we know that, once again, 750 different chemicals are used. 29 of those are on the a list of potentially dangerous compounds. Here, methanol is the most predominant of those. It's a type of alcohol that is an excellent solvent, and so we understand why it would be used there. It's relatively cheap, and unfortunately, it is also a hazardous drinking water pollutant, candidate for potential regulation under Safe Drinking Water Act. If the Safe Drinking Water Act were to apply here, we'll talk a little more about that later. Cause nervous system disorders, headaches, dizziness, nausea, etc., etc. Between 2005 and 2009, oil and gas companies used 29 chemicals that were known to or expected to cause human carcinogens. And once again, those would normally be regulated under the Safe Drinking Water Act. Here's another issue, NORM. There's an acronym you may or may not have heard for. It's called Normally Occurring Radioactive Materials. We've got materials like strontium, radium, and radon that naturally exist down in various stratas of the soil. They're not a problem when they're insulated down 6,000 feet away from where you and I are breathing, but under these extraction methods, they have ways to find their way to the surface, and that is normally not a good thing. We also have some heavy metals, lead, mercury, zinc. Once again, you don't know what you're going to encounter in the drilling process, and those can become a part of our environment instead of being down 6,000 feet below. This is just a little graphic that kind of talks about where those methane concentrations have broken out, and then some citations about the study from Duke University. I guess that's all we need to do there. We're talking about livestock here, and this is a photograph actually of a well site in Louisiana. But unfortunately, you don't have to look as far as Louisiana to find some unfortunate circumstances. As it says at the bottom, just last year in Tioga County, Pennsylvania, a head of 28 beef cows had to be contaminated for quarantine for exposure to strontium. 90, a pond had broken in, and some water that was contaminated from a pond seeped down onto their property. And if you stayed awake during high school chemistry, you understand that strontium is one of those elements that has a fairly long lifespan, decades or centuries long. So the farmer that owns those cows is probably not going to be able to do anything with them anytime soon. Talk a little bit about the air side, and the point of this slide is that the air emissions are not always obvious. These two photographs are taken at the same date, at the same facility at the same time. One was taken, the one on your left, with a normal photographic camera. The one on the right was taken with an infrared camera, and it simply shows that there are emissions coming off that tank that cannot be seen with the naked eye. So even though it may look like a nice spring day as you're driving up and down the road, there may be emissions coming off the equipment or pipelines, etc., that may be unobvious. What sort of emissions? Once again, a little list of things that may or may not be part of your environment in various stages of the process, having to do with both fugitive emissions. Those are things that just percolate off a well site or off equipment or storage tanks. Dehydration is a process that's used mostly in the West. When they have the return water that comes back up out of the well, they'll put it in a big pond and spray it around and hope that and try to evaporate the water to reduce the amount of material that they have to handle or have to carry. It's not used as much here, but it's used sometime in the summer in the east here. Certainly vehicles, we'll talk a little bit about the magnitude of traffic that's involved there. Hydrogen sulfide, once again, that's encountered at various strata in the ground. Ozone, we'll talk about a little bit later. Carbon monoxide is part of the what you're going to find in various strata and various combinations of chemicals and ingredients you'll find. Get down a little further, sulfur dioxide, you've heard of that one. That's one that EPA is pretty concerned about. VOC stands for volatile organic compounds, and it's a whole class of environmental contaminants that is very, very worrisome for a whole host of reasons, which we'll talk about later. BTEX is butane, toluene, ethane, and xylene. They talk about the Utica Formation being a wet formation, and that means that it has a lot of those compounds in it. Those are very highly valuable compounds, and most of the drilling that's going to be done around here, they're going to take great pains to try to extract those, and that's going to be, in one way, a very valuable ingredient of the process that comes out. But in the other aspect, those are very worrisome compounds, especially toluene and xylene and ethane. Very hard to control, very hard to follow, very hard to find, and very toxic. PAHs and, of course, methane. Talk a little bit about ozone. You know, we usually think about ozone as being an urban problem. We've got too many cars, too much traffic, too many factories. They produce all these chemicals. The chemicals create ozone, and ozone's a problem. Well, if you become an area that is hot and become a gas-producing field, ozone becomes a rural problem as well. And right here you see a soybean plant struggling under ozone contamination. And what will it do? Well, here are various, depending upon the concentration, you get various yield responses at 100 parts per billion. If you're growing sorghum, you're not in too bad a shape. If you're growing field corn, look out, you've got about a 10% yield decrease. That's not what we want to hear. If you're growing winter wheat, it's a little worse. It's about 20-25% yield depression from ozone. If you're growing soybeans, it's even worse, about 35%. Now, we're not too interested in the peanuts and cotton around here, but once again, ozone is a combination of volatile organic compounds, VOCs, with nitrogen dioxide and a few other things. Get it out there in the atmosphere, bake it in the sun, it becomes ozone, and comes down and it impacts plants. Cadmium, chromium, arsenic, lead, zinc, these are things that organic farmers have been worrying about for years and years and years. Most farmers don't think too much about it, unless they're in special businesses that are working about that. But those are elements that because as a result of this process, make their way to the surface And if you happen to be near an area, you need to be mindful that those are the sort of compounds that can accumulate in the soil. They can stay in the soil for decades or centuries in some cases, be persistent sources of toxins and concerns for, can transfer into milk and other components as well. Once again, there are various formations. You can have airborne contaminants, you can have waterborne contaminants that can come down and rain after the stuff reaches the atmosphere. So they are all means by which these can find their way onto the soil and onto plants themselves. Talk a little bit about fragmentation. We just mentioned it earlier, and this is sort of a 2010, I believe this is New York. Yeah, it is in New York. And this is just an indication of how the landscape changes dramatically. Because now we've heard about these well pads being much larger than the previous well pads and previous gas binges here in northeastern Ohio. But for every well, there is a roadway, and for every roadway, there's a pipeline. And so you get this matrix of crisscrossing the environment with pipelines, with roadways, and with well pads that can really change the nature and the character of a given area. We talked about the size of well pads. 4 to 5 acres is very common. I know 6 to 10 we've heard about a lot. You can have up to 8 well sites on each well pad. And once again, you can do multiple fracks on each wellhead. A very highly industrial process. Back in the day when they were fracking around here in the late 70s and 80s, I marveled at the machinery and equipment they brought in to fracture wells back in those days. Big, heavy, ornery, loud, powerful pumps and tanks and compressors and things. Well, this is like that process on steroids. And when the ground moves under you and starts shaking and shuddering, like you think the whole world's going to come to a part, that's what happened in the bad old days. Now in the good old days, we've got many times that. I talked to a farmer from Pennsylvania just last night that has dealt with this, from Washington County, Pennsylvania, not only in his farm, but many of his neighbors. And he has talked to a technician that indicates that they can operate between 13 and 15,000 pounds of pressure when they're fracturing these. If any of you have ever been out around the diesel injector when it went off at 2,500 pounds and it shot the diesel fluid under your skin, imagine what 13,000 pounds of pressure could do. Imagine trying to control that coming back out of the well, and imagine how much it can eventually emit into the atmosphere. Those are the concerns that we want people to be mindful of. Truck traffic, of course, is going to change your community. An individual well, typical well with 7 well pads. We're not just talking about a truck or 2 coming in every day. We're talking about 1,700 to 1,900 trips per an individual well. So a typical well pad with, say, 7 wells on it. We're talking about 13,000 semi-tractors coming in and out of your operation or up and down your road. It's going to change your life. It's going to change your community. Economic impact. We've heard a tremendous amount about the billions and billions of dollars that can flow in here. And frankly, I don't doubt it. I think that that's absolutely going to be true. But down in the second paragraph from the bottom, if you kind of fast forward on this, we're talking about 0.17 long-time, full-term, permanent job positions in the production in the production phase. That's after the oil derricks come down and go up to the next place. What are you left with on a permanent basis? 0.17 full-time jobs. The Halliburton exemption. Talk a little bit about the regulatory aspect of this. Back in 2005, the Federal Energy Appropriations Bill took on a right that a lot of people were worried about, a lot of people were concerned about, a lot of people waved flags about. This rider is called the Halliburton exemption. I've heard it called the Cheney exemption. And what it does is it exempts one process from exposure to Clean Water Act, Safe Drinking Water Act, Clean Air Act, and that process is hydrofracturing of wells. and processes associated with natural gas extraction. And so once again, those are exempt, those processes are exempt from the Clean Water Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, the Clean Air Act, the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation and Liability Act, called CERCLA, also the Superfund Act. That means if something really bad happens in your community, they've got to pay for it, but not in this case. If it has to do with oil and gas hydrofracking, not in this case, it doesn't apply. Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act. That sounds like a good thing. We like that, don't we? Well, if you don't depend on that, if it's associated with oil and gas hydrofracking in your community, because they're exempt of that. And our point of view is that, okay, if it is a safe process, if we are going to do it right, then why do we need these exemptions? And so it is certainly a worrisome issue. And you need to be mindful of that when you're talking to people about leasing your land and moving forward on this. We referred briefly to a US EPA study. US EPA did a study in 2004. They admitted that it was flawed on the basis of some pressure from the industry to come up with a favorable assessment. And once again, that study had to do with the impacts of hydrofracking. So EPA had just budgeted another $3.5 million to do a new study. And the results are supposed to be released by 2014. And the study is, they are committing to make sure that it's a transparent and peer-reviewed study. Up and up with all the scientific oversight and public oversight that the public has demanded. It's going to be a life cycle study. It's going to talk about everything from extracting water out of ponds and lakes to the eventual dealing with the water that comes back out of these operations. And frankly, we're looking forward to that. So here's the, we're wrapping this thing up here now. We need to ask, is Ohio prepared for high-volume, horizontal hydrofracking at this point? Now, Senate Bill 265, which was passed in 2009, was the first major revamp of oil and gas legislation in the state of Ohio in 40 years. And it didn't do much to anticipate this oil and gas boom. The main thing it did was really impact the mandatory pooling that says if you own 10 acres and your neighbors around you sign the lease, you get sucked into the deal. And there's not a whole lot you can do about it. That was the major innovation of Senate Bill 265. Now there is a report I'd like to point out to you called the Stronger Report. Stronger is an acronym saying State Review of Oil and Gas Environmental Regulations. And there's a quote from the summary of it: the future program changes in Ohio would be necessitated by the anticipated development of Marcellus and Utica shales. That's an indication that we're not there yet, that we don't have the regulatory circumstances in place to do it right. EPA has not got their air emissions rules in place. ODNR does not have their water control regulations in place. Recommendations. The Ohio Environmental Council is our official position is in support of a moratorium. We believe that the General Assembly should issue a moratorium ordering DNR to withhold approval of any new well permits pending the outcome of this US EPA study so that we know what we're doing and we know how to operate. And in the current environment, just a couple of weeks ago, we had a couple of bills introduced by a couple of state senators right here from northeastern Ohio, Senator Skindell, and actually co-sponsored by Senator Grendell, also from northeastern Ohio here. Since that time, Senator Grendell has been appointed to a judgeship in county, so he will be stepping down as a senator at this point. But Senate Bill 212, what does it do? Well, it does some interesting things. And Roger and I were just in Chairman Cliff Height's office. He's the chairman of the Agriculture and Natural Resources Committee in the Ohio Senate, and talked to him just last week. And Cliff Height seemed to agree that this bill does some good things. What it does is it allows public officials, locally elected public health officials, to come onto a site if they feel that something is happening on that site to impact the public health of their community. If there is a water spill that is affecting a creek, if there's a groundwater spill, groundwater contamination that becomes obvious, they can go on that site and they can ask questions, they can look at what's going on, and they can get some answers. So we think that that is very useful, and frankly, we have always believed in sort of local authorities having skin in the game, and so we think this is a very positive development. And it would also establish this, taking a 5% royalty off all royalties from the well, put that in a fund called the Ohio Clean Water Restoration Fund. And if the experiences of our colleagues in New York and Pennsylvania are any indication, I think that this is an extremely prudent way to proceed. This 5% of the royalties set aside into this Clean Water Restoration Fund. I think that Pennsylvania and New York are going to go well over what that 5% royalty would bring in those countries in trying to restore their resources. And so I think that it would be useful to do that. And the Senate Bill 213 is actually the moratorium bill. So it is a bill that says, thou shalt enact a moratorium. And Roger and I, at my meeting last week, Senator Haidt was not too optimistic about the prospects for that passage, and I think that's the same read that we have. But then again, our position on the moratorium is in favor of a moratorium with the idea that that resource, if it is valuable, is still going to be there next year, and 2 years from now when they get that study done, and if economics works the way economics usually work, it'll probably be more valuable next year than it was this year. And so it is, once again, prudent to just wait until the science is done, until we know what the results of this are. We're not saying turn your back on the resource. We're saying let's just hold the horses a little bit until we know where we're going.